Well, I'm delighted to welcome to Counterpoint, a series of interviews, somebody I've been trying to interview for quite some time, Professor Matthias Desmet from the University of Ghent, Professor of Psychology. And Matthias, you brought out this book, which I have here, as I was explaining just off air, and it's dog-eared. I've studied it. It was a very courageous book to bring out at the time that you brought it out, and it gave people like me and many others a framework in which to understand how an awful lot of this stuff got stuck into the human psyche through propaganda and what I would call psychological operations. You might use a different word. But it gave us a framework to understand, and we're going to get into that. But I just wanted to ask you a kind of a tough opening question, really. If you were to write again now, like if you were not, I know you were writing another book, but if you were writing that book all over again now, with the benefit of another 2 years of hindsight into what we now know and pouring through from medical science, from data and so on, about COVID and what was going on in the background, is there anything materially different you would have done?
Should I write it again? I would add an additional chapter on propaganda in the book. Because of course, like when this kind of mass behavior, crowd behavior emerges, as we have seen, as we've observed during the corona crisis, there's also usually, not always, two things involved. On the one hand, you have a population which feels lonely and is very vulnerable for certain narratives that indicate an object of anxiety. And on the other hand, of course, you have usually the people who disseminate these narratives through the mass media. And like Hannah Arendt called this the diabolic pact between the elite and the masses, which is the essence of every emerging totalitarian system. On the one hand, there is people who control a narrative, distribute a narrative, disseminate a narrative, and through the mass media. On the other hand, there is a major part of the population which is willing to buy into these narratives, no matter how absurd they are. And like in my book, I focused in the first place on the dynamics in the population. I considered to add a chapter on propaganda itself, but then I didn't, because I decided to preserve that for a next book. And,
okay.
Which will much more focus on propaganda itself. And now, of course, as you said, we have a lot of new information. We've had, for instance, the RKI files in Germany, the Robert Koch Institute files, in which someone just dumped, I don't know exactly how many, I think, was it not about 1 million pages of communication? Yeah, on the internet. So we have a much better idea now about how exactly propaganda worked. We also had the wonderful interviews of Mike Benz, who also really in a very tangible and concrete way showed us how machine learning was used during the corona crisis to map all the major corona skeptical or corona critical influencers, and then shadow ban them, or at least inhibit the dissemination of their voices. And so we have a lot of
if I could just add something there for somebody listening to this for the first time. Benz is a United States analyst, and he's done an incredible amount of work, which is basically fingering the deep state, really, in America, the military-led operations behind the whole thing. And I think that's what you're referencing there. He did a very substantial interview quite recently with Joe Rogan. And even Rogan was stunned by the information that he was putting out.
If I'm not mistaken, he was the director of the cyber portfolio at the State Department in America, so he knows what he's talking about. He's been deep in the belly of the beast, as they say sometimes. And when you listen his discourse, you hear that. He describes this in a very concrete and tangible way, how exactly this modern cyber propaganda works. Not everything, of course. He just describes in graphic detail one aspect of modern propaganda.
For those, Matthias, that are catching up, because I'm very familiar with your material, and an awful lot of people are. Your book has been a huge seller, I know, and it keeps being referenced in by academics and scientists because you gave them a psychological framework in which to understand the human proclivity to engage what you call mass formation. I've been trying to describe it more simply as human murmuration. I know it's rather simplified, but our swarming effect. But you identified, if we could just cover that, 4 conditions that are required for this to potentially take effect. Could you just run us through those 4? I know you're tired of doing it, but if we could just do it once.
I can walk you through it if you want, yes.
Yeah.
Well, for me, the essence of my work for me is that I try to show how contemporary technocratic transhumanist totalitarianism, because I really believe that we are witnessing the emergence of a fully fledged technocratic transhumanist totalitarian system, globalist also. It's a global system. And for me, like the what I really try to do with my work is I try to show people that it's not just, you cannot reduce everything to one big conspiracy. Of course, there are conspiracies involved, but in the end, the root cause of the problems, in the final analysis, the root cause of the problems is our materialist, rationalist view on man and the world. And so a few centuries ago, we started to consider to conceive the entire universe as one big machine, which functions merely according to the laws of mechanics, which is actually in the end nothing more than a set of dead elementary particles, atoms and molecules, which all interact with each other according to the laws of mechanics, which can be analyzed in a completely rational way and controlled and manipulated in a rational way. And it's this view on man and the world which led, on the one hand, it set in motion 2 very important things. On the one hand, at the level of the elite, which is crucial, it created a new elite which believed that the only way to control the population and to control society actually is by manipulating it. Like if you read, for instance, the work of such scholars like Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann, which are, I think, generally considered to be the founding fathers of modern propaganda and public relations. If you read their work, you will see very clearly that they start exactly from this observation, like the leaders before the French Revolution were true leaders. Noblemen, clergy, they could impose their will to the population. But after the French Revolution, and they could do so, this old elite, they could impose their will because they could refer to God as the authority who authorized them to impose their will. And the population, which was more or less in the grip of the religious view and worldview, accepted that. They just said, okay, yes, well, God created certain people to command others to obey, and it is like that. And maybe they usually didn't believe that really, but they acted as if it was true, and they accepted that the leaders imposed their will to the population. And then, after the French Revolution, when the religious view on man and the world was replaced by the materialist view on man and the world, leaders could not refer to God anymore to impose their will to the population. They had to be elected by the population. And consequently, rather than the leaders imposing their will to the population, the other way around happened. Like the population imposed their will to the leaders, because the leaders had to find out what the population wanted and then give them what they wanted, or otherwise they wouldn't be elected. So that's the problem where people like Bernays and Lippmann started from. Like, okay, we have no control anymore. we cannot impose our will anymore to the population, and the population is always irrational and destructive. So we will fall prey to the destructivity, the aggression of the population. So, and they found only one solution. Like, if we cannot impose our will anymore in an overt way to the population, we will have to do so in a covert way. And that's where we will have to manipulate them. We will have to manipulate them constantly. That's where modern propaganda started. And it started, it seems, from good intentions. But after 10 or 15 years, you could see how Bernays used his propaganda to topple the democratically elected government of Guatemala and replace it by a dictatorship which killed 200,000 people. So that's something very psychologically interesting. And that's what my next book is about to a certain extent. Like these propagandists, the people who make propaganda, sometimes start from good intentions, but something in the practice of propaganda perverts their minds and makes them lose their good intentions. So it's like, that's the one thing. Like, we could talk about that for hours and hours. We won't do it now, I guess. But this rationalist view on man in the world led to the emergence of an elite which used propaganda as the major organizing principle in society. But at the same time, and that was what my previous book was about, the most important thing happened at a different level. There was something even more important than the emergence of propaganda. And it was that this rationalist view on man in the world led to what Hegel, the German philosopher Hegel, called the atomization of society, meaning that the social fabric deteriorated. More and more people started to feel lonely. And it's this loneliness is key to understand what happened throughout the last 150 years. And it's key to understand how totalitarian systems emerge, because without loneliness, propaganda can never be efficacious. Jacques Ellul described that in a wonderful way. So, and that's where my previous book was all about. This materialist, mechanist, rationalist, no matter how you call it, view on man and the world, it created more and more loneliness, to the extent that just before the corona crisis, for instance, when loneliness really peaked in between 40 and 60% of the population worldwide reported not to have one meaningful relationship, and the percentage of lonely people in a country was very highly correlated with the level of technology use. The more technology, the more industrialization, the more loneliness. From a psychological point of view, you can understand that very easily. Digital conversations, as the one we have now, connect us at the level of the semantic dimension of language, the information exchange dimension. But language is much more than information exchange. The most important dimension of language is resonance. It lets the bodies of people resonate with each other, and that diminishes by 95% or something when a conversation is digitalized. In a real conversation, you will have this constant resonance of the bodies of the people who are talking. And that doesn't happen in a digital conversation. And that's one of the aspects. Of course, there are much more things, like as soon as the radio was introduced, television was introduced, as soon as the steam engine was invented, all these things, I explained it in the first 5 chapters of my books here and there, all these things led to the disruption of the human bond. And that's the starting point of the problem. Like, as soon as people feel lonely, they will typically be confronted by lack of meaning making. That means that as human beings, usually we have a spontaneous experience of meaning making every time we see that we have an effect on the other. And if you're lonely, these spontaneous experiences of meaning making drop away. They do not happen anymore. And without understanding it, when you start to feel lonely, you will usually also start to have the feeling that your life is meaningless, without purpose. And that condition isolated, lonely people who struggle with lack of meaning making, has a very important, a crucial consequence at the level of our affective or emotional experiencing. Namely, when you feel lonely and disconnected, struggle with lack of purpose in life, you will typically be confronted with what I usually called free-floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. That means a kind of anxiety, frustration, and aggression in which you don't know why you feel aggressive and frustrated or what you feel anxious for. And that state in which you feel anxious without knowing what you feel anxious for is extremely aversive. It's extremely aversive because you feel completely out of control. You cannot protect yourself from an object of anxiety that you don't know. And that's, you can see it at the clinical level, like as a psychotherapist, I see that from time to time, people who the deepest pain of a human being is when it is confronted with anxiety, which it has no clue where it comes from. And when many people are in this typical state, free-floating frustration, aggression, and anxiety, that's the moment where something very specific happens. If at that moment someone circulates, distributes, disseminates a narrative through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety and providing at the same time a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, the crusades to fight the Muslims, the witch hunts to fight the witches, the concentration camps to fight the Jews, or the lockdowns to fight a virus. If someone indicates an object of anxiety and provides a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, all this anxiety, which is freely floating in the psychological atmosphere, might at once connect to the object of anxiety in the narrative, and people might be willing to go along, to participate in a strategy, to deal with that object of anxiety, even if that strategy is completely absurd, utterly absurd. So that's the first step of a mass formation. All the anxiety is coupled to a narrative that is disseminated in a social media, usually by propaganda makers, sometimes also spontaneously, like in Nazi Germany, it happened spontaneously in the first stages. In the beginning, there was no propaganda, but then the mass formation emerged, in which everyone started to buy into these racist narratives. And then there were a few people like Hitler and some other rhetorically gifted people who used this mass formation to seize power, to seize control of society. And in the Soviet Union, the mass formation was created from the beginning by propaganda. So there was no mass formation. It was created immediately with propaganda. And so that's the first step of a mass formation. All this free-floating anxiety connected to an object of anxiety. And then the second step happens, which is even more important. Like in the second step, people have the feeling, people, because so many people at the same time start to buy into the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, start to participate in it, they have the feeling that they fight a heroic collective battle with the object of anxiety, and they feel connected again. It feels as if they transcend, they escape their loneliness, which makes them very enthusiastic. And we could see that in the corona crisis, like the nurses who were all dancing together, clapping their hands and so on. That's a strange thing of a mass formation. While it pretends that we have to prepare for war, so to say, everyone seems to be extremely enthusiastic. So, and as I said, it seems that people escape their loneliness because they do not really do. What a mass distinguishes itself from every other kind of group formation because it is not formed because individuals connect to each other from individual to individual. A mass is a group that is formed because each individual separately connects to a collective ideal. And so the bond between the individuals is not a direct bond. It's a bond which is mediated by the collective ideal. A collective ideal like fighting the virus. And so in the end, this leads to very strange things. After a while in a mass formation, the human bonds between individuals start to get weaker and weaker and weaker. All the psychological energy, all the love is sucked away from the bond between individuals, And it's all injected in the bond between the individual and the collective, meaning that after a while, the bond with the collective is much stronger than even the strongest bonds between individuals, such as the bond between a mother and her child. That's why, after a while, in a totalitarian system, mothers typically will start to report their children to the state. Children will start to report their mothers and fathers to the state if they think their mothers and fathers are not loyal enough to the collective ideal. There is this conversation with me on the internet with a woman, Shoref Ishtari, who lived in Iran during the revolution in Iran, 1978, 1979, and she was forced to witness, how a mother who reported her son to the state put the noose around the neck of her son when he was on the scaffold, and when he was hung, she was very proud to receive a medal for heroineship. So that's the dramatic end stage of a mass formation. As soon as you understand the process, it's perfectly clear. We could see that in the corona crisis as well. Everyone was talking about loyalty to each other. We had to protect each other from the virus and so on. But when someone got an accident on the street, we just accepted, or most people accepted, I didn't accept that, but most people accepted it, that they just were not allowed to help that person anymore. And when our father and mother was dying in a care institution, we were not allowed to visit them in their last hour. So that's where you see that the love in a mass is not the love for another individual; it's the love for a collective ideal. So,
and this mass formation effect, which is part of rising totalitarianism impulse, and the conditions you just outlined are so prevalent: loneliness, meaninglessness, free-floating anxiety, and of course irritation, frustration, and unvented anger, all there. How far, in your opinion, because one of the things I find fascinating about the stuff you write is that it's so grounded, and you obviously must have spent thousands of hours studying Hannah Arendt's work, which was seminal because it's pouring through. And you couldn't get a better source because she was writing and studying as it was happening. She's covered the Eichmann trial. For those that don't know who she was, you can look her up. But this is a voice coming straight out of the 20th century totalitarianism, and some of her predictions which you've referred to, are uncannily accurate about banal bureaucrats this time round the 21st century. But when you now look at it, with the benefit now of the human immune system standing up and the COVID now being in the rear view window more or less, leaving aside all of the data coming through on excess deaths and disabilities and harms and all that kind of stuff, and all the speculation about who's behind it and why and all of that. Just looking at it, how far along the road had we gone? I think Staunton covered it. It's 10 steps. How far along the road were we to extreme?
Definitely not in the end stage of a mass formation. We were not there. Because in the end stage of a mass formation, people just start to be convinced that it is their ethical duty to destroy everyone who doesn't go along with the masses. So we were not there yet, probably because there were many people who continued to speak out. That's because that's just crucial. History has shown us that, has demonstrated that in a very convincing way, like in Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union. In 1930, in the Soviet Union, the resistance went underground because they thought it was too dangerous to continue to speak out. And within 6 months, the destruction campaign started. And exactly the same happened in 1935 in Nazi Germany. So the point is, when you understand what mass formation is, when you understand the psychology of totalitarianism, you can see that the most fatal strategic mistake the resistance can make is to stop to speak out in public space. So while that's very interesting, because in a classical dictatorship is completely different. Like in a classical dictatorship, usually when the resistance stops to speak out, the classical dictator will mitigate his aggression. He will become milder. And exactly the opposite happens in a totalitarian state. In a totalitarian state, exactly the opposite happens. When the resistance stops to speak out, then first the totalitarian leaders start to unleash all their aggressive potential, and they start to destroy everything, just because They are in the grip of their hypnotic ideology themselves. And they start to become convinced more and more that they have to impose it in a relentless way to society. So looking back, where were we somewhere? We were close.
And to be clear to people, like the end stage of it is genocide, isn't it? I mean, the elimination of those that are counter narrative.
Yes, in open air. So it would be indeed the end stage is always the destruction of the people who do not go along with the mass formation. And you could see, of course, like I was baffled. But when I met a few months ago this lawyer in New York who said that there were very concrete plans to build these camps for non-vaccinated people, for instance. They were very concrete. She's suing several people there in New York. So we were quite close. And of course, the problem is that a mass formation seems to take away the loneliness, but in reality, it makes people even much more lonely. And that's what we could see after the corona crisis. We could see how when people were allowed to go to work again, or when students were allowed to visit university again, only 5 or 10% actually went back to their working place or went back to university, meaning that the loneliness is now much, much worse than it was before the corona crisis, which puts us at the risk, of course, of an even more powerful new mass formation. And you could see that as soon as the corona narrative lost its grip a little bit, the narrative on the war in Ukraine started to kick in. And then after that, narrative of the war in Israel started to kick in. So we see this. We see one mass phenomenon after the other. In my opinion, only the corona crisis can be considered a real mass formation, because what happened?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like,
So one of the. Can I just move on to maybe the background, some of the stuff going on in the background, and that I know you'll be familiar with. I mean, it seemed to me, with the benefit of hindsight, not at the time, I had to learn all this on the hoof, along with everybody else. And that's why your book your seminal book was so important when it came along. But one of the things that strikes me is that I was looking at what's now happening, and there was an attempt by the World Health Organization to land this pandemic agreement, which would have given it unilateral control over plant, animal, human health and ecosystems, decided by unelected people in Geneva that are completely outside of public prosecution for anything they do. It's quite extraordinary. And that they made an attempt to land that, and they nearly got there, except for the resistance from Japan, especially in the United States and many other places around the world. But it seemed to me that the coronavirus seemed to have been almost created to land this technocracy, which would have now given an actual legal, and would now given a structure, an actual global structure to something that could then be built out as total control from the center. Had you seen it the same way?
Oh yes, of course. And I am surprised that people are surprised by that, because as soon as you start from this materialist, mechanist fuel man in the world, as soon as you really start to believe somewhere in your head that the entire universe, the entire human society, the entire human being is a material machine, the logical consequence is that you develop an idea or that within that worldview, the ultimate state system is always a technocratic state system. If the world really is one big machine, then you need an engineer, a technical expert, to handle the machine. Why, for God's sake, would you ask a democratically elected person who maybe doesn't know anything about the machine to lead society? That's stupid. So technocracy is the ultimate consequence of the materialist fuel man in the world. And you could see, of course, how throughout the last 3 decades, throughout the last century, maybe even throughout the last 2 centuries, this idea of a technocratic state system, starting with Hobbes and his Leviathan idea, that this idea of this technocratic state system started to grow, and actually democracy only existed at the surface. Someone who wrote wonderful things about that was Aldous Huxley, in particular in his book Brave New World Revisited, which he wrote 30 years after Brave New World. That's exactly what he explains. We are actually in a system which seems a democracy at the surface, and in a few decades, he said, every broadcast and every newspaper article will be about the importance of democracy, but under the surface, he said, we will see a fully fledged technocratic totalitarian system led by a few oligarchs and their army of mind manipulators. So, of course, that's what, as soon as you see everything in mechanist terms, it's only logical that you try to take control of the machine, both at the psychological and at the physical level. And that's what we see now. On the one hand, we see the emergence in a very impressive way of a new propaganda apparatus, which now uses Google, which uses armies of hundreds of thousands of digital first responders to manipulate everything on the internet. But also, we will see how AI takes it over, how ChatGPT will be introduced as the most impressive propaganda tool ever. And at the same time, we will see that propaganda will not only limit itself to the psychological level, it will also be attempted to manipulate directly at the biological level through nanotechnology and all this kinds of shit stuff, which is anticipated by Yuval Noah Harari, but which actually is already fully developed at the practical level. If you visit websites like the website of Rice University and Mid University, you can see how far this technology is already developed. So within this mechanist view on man in the world, this is just the logical end stage, the ultimate state, the utopian state within a materialist worldview is a fully fledged technocracy. So, and we could see how it developed step by step, and how it abused this idea of democracy just to mask the development of a fully totalitarian technocratic system.
But when you describe it like that, Matthias, and with all of the backup and research and obviously, credible sources like Hannah Arendt and many others that you've just referred to there, and especially, Huxley's book and his second book and all of that, what gives me a shudder, and it's a question to you, is that, well, what if the people that are behind the propaganda manipulation for their own ends, oligarchical control with a fake democracy underneath, complete transparency at the bottom of the pyramid. We're all being monitored and surveyed, but complete darkness at the top, which is their ideal situation. And they can plunder world resources, because they'll have total control through digital IDs and passports and central bank digital currency, and all of it is there. Like, I mean, it's not a theory. It's there in formation. But what if they understood all this? They understood how mass formation actually happens. I'm talking about military-level psychological operations. They understood this and implemented it, when COVID came, that because the speed at which people were deplatformed and delicensed and denigrated was jaw-dropping, and the depth at which it penetrated the mass media, including in Ireland, was extraordinary. I mean, it just literally shut the place down. I remember looking at it absolutely astonished, and there wasn't one single voice, some economist standing up saying, "Well, this is going to lead to inflation." Nobody spoke, even at that basic level. The medical establishment stood aside and trampled informed consent. The media just went along with the state propaganda, and then the leading commentators started to vilify and demonize those that weren't vaccinated as if they were lepers. And the Constitution was set aside, despite all of this, despite all of the checks and balances. The Constitution was set aside in terms of freedom of movement, freedom of speech, as if it didn't matter. I mean, I've been looking at that saying this is organized. This is not happenstance. Now, I know you have very, very cogently outlined the psychological processes behind it, but there's also an intelligence behind the implementation of it, isn't there?
Oh, yes, there is. And of course, well, I believe that in a certain sense we will enter the darkest of all ages now. I don't know how long it will last, but so I guess the system, or no matter how you want to call it, this idea of technocratic control will flourish for a certain time, but it will fail. I at several levels, I'm quite convinced that it will fail. Like, first and for all, a society always is a complex dynamical system. And complex dynamical systems can never be predicted because they have this characteristic of so-called sensitivity to initial conditions, which means that immeasurably small deviations in the system might lead to a radical change of the entire system. So society will prove extremely hard to control, if not impossible to control. That's one thing. And there is something much more important. And it is that people who surrender to totalitarian thinking, people who are in the grip of totalitarian thinking, have no capacity anymore to develop human bonds, or at least their capacity to develop human bonds diminishes time after time. And that makes that totalitarian systems always disintegrate. And unless they can constantly take out their aggression, which inevitably emanates within a totalitarian system, and take it out on external enemies. In a globalist system, this is impossible. There are no external enemies. So the global in a global totalitarian system, you will see that the system constantly, or that the system ultimately will destroy itself on one condition. On one condition. And that's an important one. Like, of course, totalitarian systems, that was something that Hannah Arendt also described, always destroy themselves. She didn't describe it in a psychological way as I do, but she just observed it when she was writing her seminal work on totalitarianism. And the totalitarian systems destroy themselves in the end. But the crucial thing is, of course, that you have to make sure that they destroy themselves before they destroy you. So the point is, they have to destroy themselves before they destroy the entire resistance. And that's just the most important thing. I repeat that time and time again, is that the resistance continues to speak out. So the resistance has to represent, has to do exactly the opposite as the totalitarian system does. That means in a totalitarian system, when in an emerging totalitarian system, people lose touch completely with ethical principles and ethical awareness. In the first place, they absolutely do not live up anymore to the ethical duty of articulating the words that seem sincere and honest to you. And that's exactly what the people who do not go along with the system have to do. They have to represent the people that are searching for, that are living up to the eternal principles of humanity, ethical principles of humanity, in a world which is dehumanizing at record pace. So that's also what Solzhenitsyn described. Like he described exactly the same. How in the gulags, very often those people survived who, unlike the rest of the prisoners, stayed loyal to ethical principles, which is of course extremely difficult because everyone was stealing everyone's clothes and food and so on in the concentration camps. And there were some people who said, like, okay, in this pool of darkness, in this completely inhumane world, I will represent humanity. I will represent ethical awareness. No matter what happens, the others might steal my clothes, but I won't steal clothes back of the others. Solzhenitsyn gives these wonderful examples, and he said, like, that's ultimately what gives someone, a human being, the strength of defying totalitarianism.
I think that's a terribly important part of this discussion. I just want to go back on a couple of points there, because I think it's so crucial, as there has to be hope. And we know that totalitarian systems ultimately self-destruct. They run out of they run out of people to kill, basically, and they just collapse. But your point is, yeah, but like that's all very fine, but provided they don't do untold damage to the rest of us, while that's happening. But you said something earlier on that really struck me. You said that, like, we're having a digital conversation. People will get this and listen to it, and they'll be absorbing it digitally. They won't be in the room with you or me. And you were making I thought, a very important point that I was unfamiliar with. So that's what I want to ask you, because I think it'll be interesting for people. You said that the bonding that we go through, there's a resonance that happens. It's a vibration between people. It's a movement of body language. All of that doesn't come across properly in the digital era, and that ultimately it's both dehumanizing, but doesn't it also mean that the route forward is more direct human connection away? I mean, in other words, that the counter-revolution to the digital age, which I cover a lot in my own book, it is actually that. In other words, AI should support more human engagement and not take it away, ideally, and that we may see a growth in that over the next number of years. But when you look forward now, and you've really properly described and identified what's going on, and congratulations. I thought, I've read your stuff and I'm finding even this stuff fascinating, but and very hopeful as well. But how do you see it? I know it's very hard now, Matthias. None of us can see around the bend. But what's your sense of, when you look what's happening? For example, there was a shift in the European elections back to the centre. The Overton window shifted away from the left more to the right. Wokeism seems to be dying away. We've had indoctrination of kids in school around this whole critical theory. We had an attempt in Ireland, by the way. They tried to redefine what the family was and what marriage was. And the people put a run on them in March. And every single news organisation, commentariat, and state broadcaster said, vote yes. And the people came out and voted overwhelmingly no. That, to me, was a moment of great hope, because people are getting at it at an intuitive level. But how do you see, when you look at the United States now, where this inbound Republican administration is saying it's going after the deep state, it's going into the captivity of the regulatory system by the pharmaceutical industry. It's sensitive to the fact that these oligarchs, a number of them, are in far too much power, and they're operating in the darkness. And they're going after them. What's your sense of that? Do you think that's a genuine counter-revolution, or do you think it's just another step along the battle between both sides that's going to go on for a long time?
I always cherish the capacity to be uncertain. I'm not sure what will happen. But of course, we can see that it can go in two directions. In America, for instance, like on the one hand, we see indeed Donald Trump and Team Trump, let's say, including Elon Musk, for instance. We see how, on the one hand, and to a certain extent, I believe they are sincere. They claim that they will together with Robert Kennedy, for instance, tackle big pharma, big tech to a certain extent, that they will dismantle the deep state, and so on and so on. Okay. I certain of these initiatives and these plans I really like. And for instance, like Big Pharma, I really believe that someone like Robert Kennedy is really sincere and that he will do everything he can. And also Professor Jay Bhattacharya, who is a wonderful person. And I really believe they are honest and sincere in their plans to do something about that. But of course, on the other hand, we can also see how people like Elon Musk, Elon Musk is an oligarch who goes after the oligarchs, and Donald Trump, to a certain extent, both Elon Musk and Donald Trump, to a certain extent, have their connections with the deep state and the military-industrial complex. So, to a certain extent, they are rooted in these and these and the deep state. And that doesn't take away from me. Nevertheless, I do believe that somewhere they have the intention to do something about it. For instance, I'm quite sure that Elon Musk will really make the bureaucracy in America much more efficient, and that to a certain extent, both Musk and Trump want to do something about these structures which are often referred to as the deep state, while at the same time, to a certain extent, they are part of it.
Yeah.
That's the point. So it's more or less comparable with me as a university professor. I'm also part of the university world, but at the same time, if I could, I would definitely try to change something at the university structures which lead to all this bullshit science we see now. So I think it's possible to be part of the deep state and to try to change something at that level. But for me, the most important question will be, like, in the end, when Donald Trump and Elon Musk, for instance, try to do something about the current crisis in our society, about all these problems of human living together we are facing now, when they really try to change something about all these dramatic individual and collective crises that are emerging in our society, in what direction will they try to find a solution? Will they try to find a solution? Will they be aware of the fact that this rationalist, mechanist worldview, in the end, destroys the soul, the very essence of the human being? Or will they exactly try to impose more control and more surveillance to reduce criminality rates, to reduce all kinds of problems in society? That's the big question. Like, it could perfectly be that in the end, both Donald Trump and Elon Musk believe that the introduction of the digital ID and the digital coin, and so on, that the further digitalization of society is necessary to solve the problems we are facing. So that's the big question. Like, as long as Trump and Musk are in the grip of this rationalist worldview, which I'm afraid they are, then there is a very good chance that they will be the ones who ultimately introduce the end stage of the technocratic globalist system. That's we are really at risk of that. I hope they choose for another direction. I hope it, but of course we cannot also conclude that, for instance, Elon Musk. I feel a lot of sympathy for Elon Musk. Really, I feel like I really believe that he is a free speech absolutist, but at the same time, he's also a transhumanist, and so good and evil are often at the same time having an impact on the human being. And let's hope that Elon Musk finds his way to, or leaves his transhumanist and rationalist ambitions behind. Let's hope so. But no.
I'll ask you one last question, Matthias, which flows from that, because it just strikes me as you were saying that when you look at the rest of us, just the general population, we also, all of us, depending where we're coming from, are faced with the question of whether we're going to wake up and absorb what's going on, engage with this material, and break out of the kind of cognitive dissonance, or whatever way you want to call it, the hypnosis we've been under. Because the function of whether the people at the top are going to go bad or going to go the right route or the wrong route is going to be directly related to the numbers of people that actually begin to understand this stuff at the level we're talking about and begin to talk about it to their peer groups. And that's the job, really, that you were talking about, of the resistance, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. I think we should use 30% of our energy to understand evil outside ourselves, and to understand all these technocratic and totalitarian globalist structures that are so powerful, that are in charge of the world now. But we should use 70% of our energy to try to face our own shadow, and to try to become purer and more ethical beings ourselves. So in the end, the only way in which we can really contribute to solving this large collective crisis the world finds itself in now is by really tackling our own individual trauma, crisis, and darkness in ourselves. Of course, that's why I give all these workshops on the act of speech, sincere speech. Hundreds of people have followed them here in Belgium and Holland. That's exactly what we try to do now. Here, let's practice the art of sincere speech. Let's practice the art of truth speech. And step by step, you cannot just choose from the one day to the other, like to speak sincerely. No, you have to practice it like Mahatma Gandhi did. Mahatma Gandhi practiced the art of sincere speech his entire life. That's what we have to try to do. And we will see. Speak sincerely, and at the same time, you will slowly solve your own individual crisis and contribute to the solution of the collective crisis. I really believe we are in a metaphysical revolution now, which essentially boils down to this. On the one hand, we have a propagandized mass who is in control of society now. A mass in the grip of propaganda, a propagandized mass. And on the other hand, we see the emergence of a real group of people, a group of people which is not unified by propaganda, but which is unified by sincere, connecting, truthful speech. That's what I see. We have these two power blocks now. On the one hand, propagandized mass, where everyone has to have the same propagandized opinion. And on the other hand, a group of people connected by sincere speech in which everyone can have his own opinion, in which the only unifying principle is that we all share a certain loyalty to ethical principles. The first being the principle to speak sincerely and as honestly as possible with each other. Sincere. I prefer the term sincere because it's better than honesty. But yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to your next book. I think anybody who's listening to this interview are going to be looking forward to it because you're covering such important ground. And I know you're only just giving a flavour of it there, Matthias. So when in 2025 can we expect to be able to get your next piece, your next big work?
The plan is to submit my manuscript in the beginning of May next year, and then if everything goes according to plan, then it should be published somewhere in September or October next year.
Okay. Well, look, Matthias Desmet, Professor of Psychology at the University of Ghent. That's been a real rattle through it. You've made some critically important observations and given some vital information, as far as I'm concerned, to those that are following this. And I look forward to staying in touch with you. I wish you well with your next book for humanity's sake, for all our sakes. And we'll be doing our own thing over here, trying to drive this. We call it ground hurling. Hurling is a game in Ireland played with a stick, as you know. There's a particular style of hurling which is ground hurling, as opposed to aerial hurling. So ground hurling to me is bypassing the mass media and getting out there into the clubs and hotels throughout and get open public meetings and getting people to talk to one another. So I want to thank you for your contribution to all of that, whether you realize it or not. You've making a significant contribution to it. So thanks so much for the interview, and look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, Eddie, for writing your book, and which I look forward to reading, and also for having me on. Together we will contribute a little bit in spreading the awareness of what's fundamentally going on here.
Okay, Matthias, listen, you're a busy man. I'll let you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eddie. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.